need. We then plug in a database and shake everything together and get some results based on the different environmental indicators that we want to look at, for example, climate change or eutrophication. And if we want to get two comparable results, we need to standardize everything, which is what the apparel and footwear FCR has done. So the environmental footprint method is giving us how we make calculations. For example, do we need to include the impact of capital goods, the buildings or not? What do we need to focus on? How do we develop sectorial specific calculation rules? It also gives us 16 different indicators, and together with the environmental footprint database historically, we were able to get two comparable results. One of the other things that we wanted to clarify today is what an environmental life cycle inventory database is, and why we absolutely need a harmonized database to get to comparable results as well. So here we just wanted to again nail down the difference between a data point, a data set, and a database. A data point is something that you can collect, for example, an amount of grams of cotton to put in your t-shirt, or it could be a number of kilowatt hours used by a certain machine in one of your factories, or for example, the distance that your textile fabric is going to be spending between one step and another step in kilometers. A data set would be a collection of input and output flows. This is a very complicated way of saying, for example, if I'm looking at a kilo of cotton, the amount of fertilizers, the distance done by the truck in terms of kilometers, how often we're irrigating it, is it natural irrigation or not, and the amount of energy that might be needed for this, etc., etc. And it would look at all of the inputs, but also all of the outputs. Is there any waste, any emissions to the air, any emissions to the water, etc.? And all of that together is providing you with the impact of something specific. And of course, the database is then a collection of data sets, usually using the same background data. For example, how you model energy, transport, end of life, and the different modeling rules as well. Now, of course, there's different types of data that can exist. There's primary data that has been collected directly and that is specific to your product. So it could be collected by you, but it could also be collected by one of your suppliers or someone in your supply chain, but it relates directly to your activity and your product. Whereas secondary or default data is something that's not specific to your product, but that is hopefully a good estimation for you. So again, primary data when we're talking about cotton might be from the actual farm that the cotton is coming from for your t-shirt, but you may not have access to this information. Instead, you might know that the cotton is coming from a specific region in the world, in which case you might be able to just use a data set that is representative of cotton in that region with that specific agricultural practices, for example. Why we need a single database is to avoid having differences between products that would just be coming from differences in databases. We've listed two examples here on why modeling can create differences in environmental impact. For example, the first one is the age of data. If we're looking at China, this is the country with the fastest greening electricity mix in the world. So that means that if we're looking at 2020 versus 2023 data, you'll see that there's already almost a 2% difference in the share of renewable energy in the energy mix. So that means that just if, say, database A was using data from 2020 and database B data from 2023, you could see that the impact of database B for Chinese electricity is probably going to be lower because there's a higher share of renewables. This is not to say that database B is better or worse, it's just that it's a more recent data set. And if for your product you're using database B compared to database A, then you would probably have a lower footprint for everything that is using that Chinese electricity data set. Again, not because you've changed anything, just because of the age of the data. In a similar way, with the modeling, for example, for recycled polyester, there are different ways of modeling recycling. It all depends a little bit on how you allocate the burdens and the benefits of recycling between the product that is being recycled and the product that is using the recycled material. So for example, if database A was using an approach where all of the benefits of the recycling, so using non-virgin material, but also all the burdens, the actual impact of recycling, was allocated to the product using recycled polyester, that would be quite different than if you had shared benefits and burdens of these activities between the product being recycled for its end-of-life stage and the product using the recycled content for its raw material stage. So again, here it's not that one is better than the other, it's just that there's a difference in approach. And if you were using database A versus database B, you would get different results, but this would not be a translation of differences in how the product was designed, for example, but simply of how the modeling was done. So really artificial differences. So this is why we need to use one single database to get to comparability. Now, let's talk about the environmental footprint database itself. As a lot of you probably have heard, we have been using what's called the EF 3.1 database in the last year since the PEFCRs were published, but really in the last couple of years. The EF 3.1 database is the 3.1 version of this generation of databases, is very much coming from a historical approach to creating the EF database. It's coming from centralized funding, which is fully coming from the European Commission. So this is all public funds, where the European Commission is agreeing with some external providers to make datasets available for free when used with a PEFCR. The problem here is that the European Commission has the centralized governance, so they decide which data sets get developed, but they don't do the data development themselves. So they have contracts with usually commercial database providers that then do the development of data, but want to still protect their IP. And that leads to a contract for a certain number of years for the database to be made available for free to different users. The good thing about that is that, of course, there were over 4,400 data sets available in the EF 3.1 database. Over 800 of those were specifically for our sector. And as mentioned, they were available for free for a certain time. However, the problem is that these data sets at some point expire, and that every single time the European Commission has to start from scratch whenever they're starting with the new version of the database. Because they don't own the data sets, they don't have the possibility to maintain them by simply doing some switches, and instead they have to start from scratch again. There is a bigger shift, a more philosophical shift that is currently happening around the EF database, which started in 2022 with an 18-month call for tender, and which got to a certain conclusion in January last year, where the European Commission published a report that is kind of giving some information on the direction that the EF database will take from generation 4 onwards. And with that in mind, a number of datasets are expected in Q1 2028. They are likely going to be mostly core datasets, so everything that is not sector specific. That could be energy, transport, end of life, but not necessarily the materials or the processes that would work for our sector. We are expecting some conversations to resume in what the EF4 general framework might look like later this year if everything goes well, but there's still a number of question marks here. Now I'm going to give the floor to Margot, who's going to tell us more about why the expiry of the EF database can be a problem for a brand.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So yeah, as Emily said, the idea is to show you the concrete consequences for a brand of this situation and what we could imagine as a solution to go forward with this situation. So you can go to the next slide, Emily. So just to start, a bit of context about Decathlon and the environmental assessment. So at Decathlon, we calculate the life cycle assessment of all our products for more than 10 years now. And we do that for three main reasons. The first one is eco-design. We developed an eco-design approach that is really data driven. And so we want to have at every level in the company the right data to make the best decision possible to reduce the environmental impact of our product. And so having the life cycle assessment of all our products enable us to do that more properly. Then there is a topic around communication, and so this is actually quite the same, but we want to ensure that when we communicate eco design um, eco design approaches to our customers, we want to make sure that this is um, scientifically robust, and so we want to verify it with a life cycle assessment. And the last point is around SBTi commitments and trajectories. Having access to the life cycle assessment of all our products enable us to translate the company SBTi commitments at every level into the company, and so to make sure that everyone knows how to contribute to this target. So that's why we calculated all our impacts, and you can go to the next slides, please. And so, yeah, from the beginning, I would say we were very supportive to the PEF methodology because we believe that this methodology will help us to achieve comparability between among competitors on the calculation of our impacts. And it will also maybe help us to go beyond carbon because we know that in the PEF we have all the other indicator, and the European Commission is also working on the integration of more criteria regarding biodiversity and microplastic, for instance, that are really important for us to go beyond this vision around carbon. And finally, there is also the benefits of having a clear and common methodology that will ensure for the customers transparent communication of brands regarding the impact of their products. And so how do we calculate the environmental impact of our apparel and footwear products at Decathlon? So I've taken the, the slide from To Policy just to show you. So actually before 2022, we were using a PEF-like methodology and a mix of databases to ensure that we are as much as possible close to what is expected by the PEF methodology. And so we could say that we didn't have at this time comparable results with other competitors that could do the same because we were not using the same databases. Then from 2023, we did with Glimpact a switch to the EF 3.1 methodology and the apparel and footwear PFCR. So from 2023, we were using this method and EF compliance data and the European Commission database with also company-specific datasets. So what Emily was explaining to you around the primary data. For some of our processes, we are able to collect data from our supply chain, and so to enter company-specific data sets that are really representative of what happened in our supply chain. So at this period in time, we could say that we have comparable results with other competitors that would have applied the apparel and footwear PFCR because we are using the same data and the same methodology to make the calculations. And now, so doing that had some benefits for us. So first, the reliability of our eco design levels, because as said that we are using one database, so we have the same background hypothesis for all our data, and so we make sure that what we have as eco design levels really represents a reduction in impact. This is not due, for instance, due to a different energy mix in one data set compared to another. And the other point is that by having this clear methodology, we also could incentivize or push our suppliers to provide us PEF compliant data. And so it's a good way to increase the coverage of all the processes and raw materials that we are using, because the suppliers know exactly what methodology we want to apply, and also there are pretty confident in the fact that what they will develop for us will also be useful for other of their other customers. And so the next step is then 2028, where we know that we should have the EF 4.0 methodology available and potentially a common database, a common core database that we could use to calculate our environmental impacts. So yeah, let's hope that in 2028 we will be able to have the same methodology and the same database for everyone and to have comparable results. But during this time we are like in between, and this situation has concrete results for us that we can see in the next slide. So the first one is that having not having any more access to the EF 3.1 database represents an unplanned and massive data switch that we need to make. For instance, for us, it represents 80% of our former database to be replaced by other datasets. This is also, there is a lot of uncertainty regarding the strategy to adopt to do this switch, because there are a lack of visibility of the databases that are accessible to replace EF 3.1 and what will be the common consensus in order to do this replacement. And there are also consequences on the quality of the assessment we are doing, because there is a reduced comparability between the results of the different brands. We also have a reduced consistency internally because we have to mix several databases with different background hypotheses, and also some data gaps. So for instance, for chemical recycling, we are not able to find data sets that completely replace the one that were available in EF 3.1. And so what we recommend as solutions to go forward on this topic is first, as an interim solution, to agree as an industry on the default data sets to be used. And so Emily will talk a bit about that just after. And then our ideal long-term solution will be to make sure that the industry is taking in charge the development of this sectorial database that we need. So having a core database that is developed by the European Commission for energy, transport, and so on, and then an apparel and footwear database with a list of datasets that is established by the industry and the brands, making sure that it covers all the raw material and all the processes that we need. And then a technical committee that could review the data sets to ensure their representativity of the sector. And finally, data sets that are developed based on industry data and not only on literature, to make sure that we represent the evolutions that we've seen in the textile sector, for instance, in the next year, and make sure that the data is really representative of what happens in this industry.
Thank you, Margot. And so this is where we're now going to be making use of a new guidance that was published by the European Commission in June, so a month ago. They have recognized that although the environmental footprint method asks for the use of environmental footprint compliant data sets, most of those coming from the EF database historically, there is no EF database to speak of as of now, and that it was a bit of a frustrating moment for those of us having worked on the PEF-CRs for apparel and footwear for such a long time, and of course everyone who started using them, like described by Margot just now. So they have published this guidance document as an interim solution to the fact that there is no EF database right now. And so the Commission is now allowing the use of commercial databases in the interim period. So likely until Q1 2028, we'll have to see if this is the actual date or if there's some delays there. And PEF-CRs have the possibility to select a list of datasets to be added as an annex. The main objective here is to retain comparability between PEF studies. So if everyone starts using the same database, even if that database has some shortcomings, for example, some data sets that aren't necessarily good enough as of now, at least they are the same databases that are being used by everyone. We have selected two databases, but Franzi will tell you a little more about this in the coming slides. Of course, the idea here that we had is that we had to cover both the core data sets, so again, everything that relates to electricity, transport, end of life, as well as the sectorial data sets needed for the apparel and footwear specific gaps. So Franzi, the floor is now yours again.
Great, thank you. So I'll tell you now more about how we came to the list of datasets to be used instead of the EF 3.1, where we are right now and what's coming next. So our starting point was the same one we've mentioned already, the datasets from the now expired EF 3.1 database. And we took that list and ran it through an industry review. So apparel and footwear companies checked which materials and processes do they actually need to model their products. We removed a bunch of data sets that were not relevant anymore, and we added some that were missing. And we ended up with a list of 641 sectorial data sets. On top of that, because also the core data sets expired, we started with the default data sets from the Annex 7 of the PEF-CR, which gives you the data sets for the use phase, packaging, transport, end of life. And we also added electricity. So that list was now our starting point, and we then looked into which databases could serve this list. So we had conversations with each database provider that you can see here to assess how suitable are they. We looked at which format can they provide, what are their business models, the licensing, and can they be used in a variety of LCA tools, and also how good is their coverage of apparel and footwear processes. And you can see here some household names like EcoInvent and Sphera that provide a wide range of data sets, but maybe don't cover as much apparel and footwear data sets, while some more really industry-focused databases like Qantas WorldDB or also Cascale are really good at that.
One thing that we just wanted to mention here is that we know there's a lot of evolution in the database space at the moment. There's been a number of open data developments in the last weeks even. And so the TS is very much trying to keep track of everything that is happening in that space. It's a bit of a roller coaster ride in the sense that every week or every 2 weeks there's some news. And the decisions that we've taken as of now are the best decisions that we can take with the information available now. But of course, you'll see that we're still having a little bit of delay before the publication of the final list. And we'll have to see, I guess, all of the developments that might happen before then or even after then to try and take all of these possible changes into account.
Based on the analysis, then we picked EcoInvent as our primary database and Qantas as the secondary, as Emily also described earlier. And then we mapped the list of data sets that we need against these two databases. So we went dataset by dataset to find the best available substitute. We compared each dataset's name and the technical description, so the metadata, against what's available in EcoInvent and WorldDB. EcoInvent was always the first choice since it's the primary database, and then only when EcoInvent had no suitable match, we then turned to WorldDB. But because this kind of matching always involves some judgment calls, it will now go through 2 rounds of reviews. First, the database providers themselves reviewed the proposed matches, and now at the moment it's open for the technical secretariat members to review and propose where they think a better dataset exists. Before I go show you the actual mapping of what came out of it, just want to explain quickly how we judged what was a good match or maybe not. And so we have 4 categories that describe how close each match was. So perfect match means the name and metadata is it describes an identical technology and the same region. If it's a partial match, then it still uses the same technology, but maybe there's a slight difference in yarn count, for example, or it uses a slightly different region. For example, in EcoInvent, often datasets are divided between Europe and rest of world, while EF 3.1 datasets were often global. So rest of world is still a good match, but it's not identical. Then partial match still uses the same core technology, but the same technology family, but it's not the exact same process. For example, when we had to use a generic spinning data set instead of a specific technology. And then proxy is the lowest one. So for example, when we had to use a generic recycling data set standing in for a textile specific recycling data set. And that brought us to this analysis. So we matched the sectorial, the 641 datasets from the list of datasets that we needed against EcoInvent, where we found 317 matches. And then we matched the rest of them to WallDB, which were 322 matches, 2 still unmatched, which is quite good for 600 datasets. And below we find the split depending on the match category. And then additionally, obviously, we also matched the core data sets to transport use phase electricity to EcoInvent. As a next step,
No, because you
oh
have,
yeah, we
yes.
will while this matching is going through the review of the TS, obviously after the review, this list will be delivered as an annex with all the chosen data sets. And what we also will provide is the matching. So which EF 3.1 dataset did we match to EcoInvent and WallDB? And we will also added some notes why we did match or made some judgment calls.
In terms of next steps, yes, go on, Fonzie.
Thank you. Like I said, the TS review is ongoing. They have time till the 27th of July. We will then look at their comments and suggestions and do a follow-up meeting in August, where we'll look at some comments. Maybe we'll need to have some decisions on some data sets. And then we plan to publish the annex and also the Excel sheet in September, where we'll also hold another webinar to share and introduce the mapping again.
Thank you. And there is another project, this is not the topic of today's webinar, that is trying to resolve the longer term issue of the lack of good quality data sets for some of the materials and processes that we've been using aside from the EF 3.1 database. And if this is something that could be of interest to you, feel free to reach out and we could tell you a little bit more about it. Now we're going to enter the Q&A part of the webinar. We've already received one question, 2 questions. One was answered already in the Q&A box. Feel free to type more if you want to. The first question was if the TS discuss or negotiate anything with the 2 database providers that were selected, and if the providers will make the datasets available to software providers at a reasonable and equitable licensing cost or for free. There are, and I'm clicking on Answer Live, there are discussions that are currently ongoing. Of course, EcoInvent as a database is already used in most of the different platforms that have applied the apparel and footwear PEFCR. And so as such, it was prioritized, for example, over Sphera, which we know is not used as much. We are currently in discussions with Qantas to try and see how we could make these data sets accessible in an easy way. The idea, of course, is not to let all of the individual tool providers have to go and negotiate with Qantas one-on-one, because that would be extremely painful for everyone involved, but to try and come up with a general agreement that would work for everyone. Another question, couple couple of questions. On the EF database itself, so there was one question on understanding what drives the expiration of EF datasets. What's the criteria or governance process used to decide when a dataset is no longer considered valid? This question is, for now, very much a contractual question. It's not about the quality of the data sets themselves. It's about the contracts that were done and signed between the European Commission and the dataset developers. So these contracts are usually for a certain length of time, usually 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, that means that the provider of data could decide to make the database available for longer if they wanted to. Historically, that has happened. But as of the EF 3.1, because I think this is probably the 5th time that this expiry problem is happening, the different providers have decided to not make these datasets available. One thing to note, though, is that there are criteria in the EF method that would lead to the expiry of a dataset, and that would be related to the data quality rating formula that you can apply to any dataset, where you assess how good a dataset might be based on its age, how the dataset was built, was it with collected information or just a literature review, was that verified or was that not verified, and is it a good representative match for your geography and your technology? And then depending on the type of process, there are some processes that we know will have a high impact on your footprint. So the PEFCR is asking for relatively good quality data sets to be used for those versus lower quality available for the others. But in this current situation, it's literally just a contractual agreement expiry. And that was another answer of the same question. There are a couple of comments on the expiry of the datasets and what the recommendation would be for companies. Margot, because you were talking about this, is that something you want to start with and I can maybe complement afterwards?
Yeah. So yeah, my recommendation would be to agree at the industry level on the data sets and the databases we want to use, and this is currently what we are proposing with the technical secretariat, actually. So this would be the first recommendation, and the second, but this is more in the long term, is how could we work together to build a common database that is really representative of our industry. But yeah, this will be maybe in the second time.
Thanks, Margot. And I think this is also what the European Commission is aiming for in the end. The new vision for the EF4 database is to have a more decentralized both governance model, so being able to influence what's in the database, not just by going through the European Commission, but possibly other actors as well, but also, and more importantly, for the decentralization of data development. So what that means is that it wouldn't just be the European Commission paying a third party for development of data, but that other trade associations, academia, or even commercial databases would be able to submit data sets to be part of the EF database, meaning that they could maintain their own data sets and make sure that they don't just expire as well. And the European Commission would gain the IP, this time of the core data sets, to make sure that everyone can use them in the sectorial data sets. But that is something that needs to be still validated and confirmed. This is more of a theoretical perspective on the database rather than a practical one so far. And that answers another question, which was about that common vision of core database. So indeed, the intention of the European Commission is to develop and maintain a more detailed control of these data sets. And I don't know that they do the data development themselves, but at least they would pay to own the IP, meaning that they would be able to update the data set as of then. Looking at the different questions, there is one question on, isn't Quantis also the technical lead in the technical secretariat? How is an independency ensured while choosing the correct database? That is a very good question. Quantis was the technical lead in the development of the PEFCR, but the project of the development of the PEFCR finished in May last year. And this project is more of the technical secretariat deciding to pick up the possibility offered by the European Commission to draft an annex. And this did not involve any technical development or an additional contract with Quantis, meaning that the TS made this decision absolutely independently, and Quantis was only consulted as one of the various possible database providers and not as an involved party in this decision making. Then I see some of the questions on the governance of these important decisions. And so indeed, the TS has been reconstituted. We have started this directly from the previous members of the TS. We have lost a couple of members in the meantime, some companies that have decided to not be involved in these conversations. It is a pretty technical conversation, and if you haven't necessarily had conversations on databases and which ones you want to use, then it could be a little too technical for some people, which is mostly why we've lost some members. In terms of the decision-making process, we actually took, I would say, almost 6 months to make this decision. The European Commission told us that they were planning on drafting a guidance that would go in this direction in December, and it took them 6 months to publish it. And so we started conversations on one, if the TS wanted to develop an annex or not, because there was a possibility to not do this and to let individual users of the PEFCR make their own decision when it comes to the database they wanted to use. But the TS has decided to go for the drafting of an annex to be able to keep the comparability, which we think is a good strength of the PEFCR. And then afterwards, we had, as mentioned, interviews with the different data providers, and we had listed some criteria that we felt were really important to us. Of course, the coverage of the industry was one of the key elements, because we didn't want to have to use really bad proxies all the time for all the materials and all the processes, which is why actually we ended up going for 2 databases and not just one. And then another really important point was the interoperability. Because we know there's a lot of different platforms, a lot of different tools, we wanted to make sure that the databases that we were selecting were usable in all the platforms. And if you're familiar with some of those databases, some of them are required to be used in only one platform. And this is the type of partners that we didn't want to go with. There was another question on the dataset list and if this is going to be set in stone through to 2028, or if it would be possible to update it if better datasets, maybe more accurate or less expensive, become available in the meantime. On this one, this is, I guess, a bit of a question that we could ask to the European Commission. To be fair, we haven't. 2028 is not that far away. It's only 18 months from now, really. So I suspect if the database is not massively late, which it could still be, we probably wouldn't go through the process of redoing a mapping just for this short amount of time, because of course the stability of the different databases is also important for brands, like Margot mentioned, and changing databases every 6 months or a year is probably not feasible in terms of implementation as well. We are hoping that, at least from an expensive perspective, we do get to, I would say, a not crazy expensive option with the databases that we have selected so far, but we're still in the middle of discussions with the 2 database providers, so we cannot say too much as of now. Okay, so there's another question on the long-term project, and there's another question on EF4, so I think I can answer these 2 questions at the same time. So on the EF4 dataset, as I mentioned, the idea is to go to that new philosophy. So that means that the European Commission would own the IP of the core datasets, and so they would be able to do basic maintenance. This is, for example, what I showed with the electricity grid of China, where you probably do want to update it and you do want to see changes to reflect the greening of the electricity grid in China, for example, to be able to make the appropriate eco-design decisions. So for example, if you want to manufacture in a country that has a greener electricity mix, it's good for you to be able to know that the electricity mix is changing. And this is, I would say, part of the regular update just to reflect the reality. And then because the European Commission would own the IP of these data sets, it wouldn't be a stop and go like we've seen now, or like we've seen pretty much between every single EF database versions in the past. So probably not every 5 years. For the sectoral data sets, it depends a little bit on who's submitting them. And having to renew the data sets used every 5 years is not crazy when you think about how quickly things can change. There are new data sets. Again, there's the greening of the electricity grid and all of this. But we would see an incremental change, like when you're staying within the same database, rather than a drastic change that could be just coming from methodological change instead of just evolution of practices, for example. In terms of the other question, for the long-term project, improving the data sets that have been flagged. This is not a public list, so I would invite you to message me, and I'm happy to share it with you as well if you're interested. We are in the process of discussing with a few companies that are willing to fund this initiative, which data sets we're going to focus on. We're not a massive group, and there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of the policy landscape as of now. So it's a pretty modest project for now, but it could become the first project of a series of projects. So feel free to reach out. I might just go back to this one, to my email address, and then I'll be happy to answer you individually. Submitting datasets is something that was also suggested in one of the comments. Again, feel free to reach out if you're interested in doing that. Right now, the mapping that we're doing for the PEFCR Annex is based on existing datasets and databases. And if you have a dataset that you think might be relevant and worth using, and that could be consistent with the decisions that we have made so far, we possibly could be looking at it. So feel free to reach out, but rather sooner than later if possible. One other question, Clément, you are very proficient in questions. I like this. Indeed, we are going to be using only one group of data sets that will be coming from at least 2 databases so far. To be used, keeping with the main principle of one dataset per use case that is at the basis of the environmental footprint database initially. Again, the reason here is comparability. So if you have the same dataset coming from 2 different databases, then if you're picking dataset A or dataset B, you might get inconsistent results. And so the idea is to try and avoid having this situation by making sure that people can pick the dataset that is for their use case without having to decide anything. We are not the PFCR for leather people, so I think this is a question for Cotence. We are in touch with them, generally speaking, to make sure that we do have a good leather dataset, but we cannot really answer on behalf of the PFCR for leather. And the final question, because I think the other one we really did answer, is on the role of academics in the development of review of datasets. I think this is a more generic question. Right now, for the databases that we're going to be using, this process has already taken place. So both EcoInvent and Quantis have some review steps in the development of their datasets. In our project, we have mentioned that we want to make sure there is sorry, no, actually, that we're just going to pick up the existing databases as they are. But in a data development project, that is when we would be making sure that there are reviews by the right people. And this is where I think academics can have a role in developing and reviewing data sets, as well as, for example, the experts in the sector. So the cotton industry, of course, is best placed to review cotton data sets as well. Or, for example, indeed some polyester manufacturer or expert as well. But this is a more generic question. All right, that was a lot of questions. I don't, so there's a final question. I think afterwards we can close the webinar on if there's other mapping initiatives to fill this gap. So there is really only one legal pathway, I would say, to adding an annex to the PEFCR, and that is for the TS to do. So this is the mapping initiative that will lead to PEF compliance, or compliance with the PEFCRs at least. And then if other people are doing other mappings, of course, that is of their own rights. But if you want to remain as aligned to the PEFCRs as possible, then that implies having to use the datasets that will be added as an annex. And the last question was who's done the analysis of these databases and the mapping. This is us, this is Fonzie actually, which is why she was talking to you about this. And we have worked together hand in hand with Ecoinvent and with Qantas. Do you want to tell us a little more about this, Fonzie?
Yeah, so as he said earlier, we did an interview with all of the database providers. We asked them all of the same questions regarding the coverage, the licensing, and all of these different points that I highlighted earlier. And we present them to the TS. Obviously, not all of them could join these meetings, so these were held by Emily and me and the database provider, and then depending on the call, also a few of the TS members or brands could join. And but we shared full notes and all of the feedback back to TS, and then based on a vote, the TS, the voting members, chose their preferred database provider.
I think here the question was more the individual mapping of the dataset.
Oh, apologies. The individual mapping of the datasets. So the based, like we said earlier, were based on the matching was done on, sorry, the matching was done based on the name and metadata. So we didn't have access to the underlying modeling of the different data sets, but we matched them with the information that we had. And this was sometimes obviously easier when it's a very generic transport data set versus when it is a very specific text type processes where you maybe don't have a one-to-one replacement.
And yeah, the follow-up question is if we are objective in this task. We have tried to be objective in this task. There's initially 26 voting members in the TS. That's been a bit of a reduced number ever since. And everyone was invited to the different meetings, like Fonzie just mentioned. And to be honest, there was no real debate on the selection of the dataset providers. It was almost, yeah, I want to say almost unanimous in the sense that for the core data sets, we had a pick between Ecoinvent and Sphera. They're the only two options, really. The Sphera database can only be used in the Sphera tool, which was extremely limiting from an interoperability perspective. So that meant Ecoinvent was pretty much a no-brainer decision. And then afterwards, indeed, in the Qantas database, there were conversations with the other databases that were available earlier this year, and it turns out that most of the TS members selected WorldDB. We only facilitated as to be policy. We do not make decisions, and yeah, in that sense, there was no influence really at this stage. All right, I think it is now 5 minutes to the hour. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. We We'll be coming back to you with more information in September, and we will be keeping you informed of the development of the TS mapping and publication of the annex, and we'll be communicating on the date of the next webinar. The idea will be to then share the mapping and actually launch the mapping in September. For everyone to consult. If you have any additional concerns, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to take some one-on-one conversations as well. Thank you so much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Everyone, bye.
Recording stopped.